Welcome to the webinar, COVID-19 and Anthropology, Disease, Social Justice, and Well-Being, hosted by the New York Academy of Science, Anthropology Section's Distinguished Lecturer Series. My name is Uzma Rizvi, and I am an Associate Professor of Anthropology and Urban Studies at Pratt Institute here in Brooklyn, New York. In my role as Chair of the Board of Anthropology Section, New York Academy of Sciences, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us from all the various places you may be from. In addition to this webinar, we are attempting to live stream on social media, which is partially where our technical issue has emerged from. But we will have a recording of this event on our YouTube channel as well. And more information about this will be sent to you after the webinar. I'd like to begin by thanking our many sponsors, including the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, the Department of Anthropology, Hunter College, and Bergen Books. I'd also like to thank the staff at Roosevelt House, in particular, Daniel Culkin, who is their program coordinator for providing us with the back-end support for this webinar. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the many hours of work done by our Board of Advisors for the section, and in particular, our Anthropology Section Fellow, Dr. Rachel Daniel. Without all of them, none of this would be possible. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at NYAS_ANTH. You can like us on Facebook. You can join our listserv and become part of our vibrant community of anthropologists. Here we go, at least my video is working. Please know that throughout the course of the webinar, you can post questions in the question and answer section on the lower bar of your Zoom menu. There's an example of that on our on the slide that you saw prior to this. Or if you are on Facebook and we have managed to go live there, in the comment section. We will be collecting the questions throughout the program and hope we can get as many of them as possible through the course of the panel. We can't, of course, promise that we will get to all the questions, but we will certainly try to do as many as we can. Webinars on the topic of COVID-19 have been taking place globally. More locally, in the US context, the American Anthropological Association has been hosting webinars on various topics related to the pandemic. And I was just informed today by Professor Emily Martin that the upcoming Anthropology Now issue is also dedicated to COVID-19 and will be available open access from Taylor and Francis in just a few days. The Anthropology section of the New York Academy of Science has a distinctly public mission, and it's within that ambit and mission, and keeping that in mind, that we are hosting an open public panel focused on COVID-19 and anthropology. Our theme this year has been sustainable humanity, social, political, and ecological considerations. This being our final program for the year really highlights some of our key concerns as we move forward, questions around our futures, social justice, and well-being. And we are uniquely thrilled to have such an esteemed and remarkable panel to present to you this evening. I will introduce our panelists in alphabetical order, and as I do, you will see each of them on the screen so that you can link a face to a name. I'm going to begin with Dr. James Jones. So Dr. Jones, if you could turn your video camera on, everyone will be able to see your face. Jamie Jones, Associate Professor of Earth System Science, is a biological anthropologist with a strong background in classical social anthropology and training in human evolutionary, behavioral, and population ecology. Prior to his current position in the Department of Anthropological Sciences at Stanford University, he had an interdisciplinary postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Washington in the Center for AIDS and STD, the Center for Statistics and the Social Sciences, and the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology. With methodological expertise in formal demography, social network analysis, modern statistics, and transmission dynamics modeling, interdisciplinary connections across the social, natural, and environmental sciences, and research interests that address both the core and frontiers of demography and disease ecology, Dr. Jones brings together social networks, demography, and transmission dynamics in the context of broader questions of human ecology. Welcome, Dr. Jones, to the panel. Our next panelist, Dr. Shirley Lindenbaum. Dr. Lindenbaum, you can turn on your camera. Dr. Lindenbaum is Professor Emerita from the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and has a BA in Literature and Language from Melbourne University, an MA in Anthropology from the University of Sydney, and an honorary doctorate from Melbourne University in 2016. She taught at the New School for Social Research between 1977 and 1989, and at the Graduate Center from 1989 to 2009, and has carried out research on cholera in Bangladesh, AIDS in the United States, and Kuru in Papua New Guinea. Welcome, Professor Lindenbaum. Thank you for being here. Our third panelist is Professor Durga Sangaramurthy, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is a cultural anthropologist with expertise in medical anthropology and epidemiology. Her research focuses on improving care for those living with HIV, developing more effective care systems for non-citizen immigrants, amplifying local community expertise as a transformative tool for enacting policies and practices that effectively address disparate environmental risks in communities of color, and advocating for social justice. Her writings on these topics appear in a wide range of scholarly and mainstream publications. She's also the author of Rapid Ethnographic Assessments, a practical approach and toolkit for collaborative community research, which is coming out from Routledge this year, 2020, and Treating AIDS, Politics of Difference, Paradox of Prevention from 2014. Let's welcome Professor Sangaramurthy. Also, I hope your video is on. Our fourth panelist is Professor Meryl Singer, Emeritus Professor of Anthropology and Senior Research Scientist at the Center for Health in Intervention and Prevention at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Singer's work has focused on infectious disease and environmental health and includes research on HIV/AIDS, STIs, hepatitis, Ebola, tick-borne diseases, and arbovirus diseases. He is the author of 33 books and over 200 peer-reviewed articles. Social justice, the social determinants of health, syndemics, and critical medical anthropology have been enduring themes of his research and applied work. He is now focused on the ramifications of COVID-19 as a global syndemic. And our final panelist is Professor Amber Bhootish, President's Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Center for Global Health in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University. Concerned with the cultural institutions that make us sick and keep us well, her research focuses on basic human challenges like water insecurity, food insecurity, and global mental health. An ethnographer and methodologist with over 100 publications, Professor Bhootish edits the journal Field Methods with Dr. H. Russell Berner. Her latest book, co-authored with Dr. Alexandra Brewis, is Lazy, Crazy, and Disgusting: Stigma and the Undoing of Global Health. This came out in 2019 from Johns Hopkins University Press. Professor Bhootish was selected as Carnegie Case Arizona Professor of the Year in 2014 and in recognition of outstanding career as a university educator. I'd also like to add a special thanks from the board of the anthropology section for all of her help in conceiving this evening's program. We really appreciate it. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening. Dr. Tanya Taylor is an assistant professor in the College of Medicine and Division of Infectious Disease at SUNY Downstate Medical Center and an investigator in the Combined Cohort Study, or CCS, which is the largest observational cohort study on women and men living with HIV in the United States. Dr. Taylor has over 20 years of experience in design and implementation of ethnographic and survey research in the US and Southern and East Africa. She is a medical and linguistic anthropologist, receiving a joint PhD in anthropology and folklore from the University of Pennsylvania, and has a substantive focus on HIV and aging and sexual and reproductive culture. In 2009, she completed a 3-year NIMH postdoctoral fellowship at the HIV Center for Clinical and Behavioral Studies at Columbia University, and an MS in Biostatistics at the Mailman School of Public Health. In 2011, she was awarded an NIMH Career Development Award to identify the prevention needs of older women with HIV and developed a healthy HIV aging intervention. And in 2013, she became a Butler Williams Scholar at the National Institute of Aging. I will now pass this on to her to begin the panel. Thank you, Tanya.
Oh, okay. First, let me just say this is such an honor to be able to help facilitate this conversation with a lot of my heroes. Oh, my Christmas. All right. So there are going to be technological glitches. Excuse me, I apologize. So this is such a pleasure. And I am honored to have this opportunity to participate. We're going to first start our conversation talking about social responses. So just as a prompt, I'd like to say that we are aware that epidemics have the power to dramatically change society and culture. And indeed, entities or individuals that are tasked with the awesome responsibility of formulating our global, national, state, or even local level responses to the coronavirus pandemic have also emerged as important agents of social and cultural change, some for better and some for worse. For many of us on this panel, it's hard not to recognize or to see clearly the parallels in both the political and social responses to COVID-19, as well to the similarities between COVID-19 and our responses to HIV/AIDS. With the exception that COVID-19 doesn't sort of carry with it the hurtful stigma of personal character that so many people living with HIV have had to endure. Some of these parallels have included that Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump have inexplicably delayed their acknowledgement of the urgency of the situation. There's been rampant dissemination and misinformation to foster both social fragmentation and politicization. There have been dangerous discourses of blaming either the African or Chinese other, and subsequent rise in racism, xenophobia, and acts of violence. There have been fake cures, reminded of Jim Baker's silver solution, and conspiracy theories that either the virus was created to kill our LGBTQI plus and brown and Black communities, or that this somehow was a Democratic plan to undermine Donald Trump's reelection. My question to our panelists first is, what lessons learned from the HIV AIDS epidemic or other epidemics could we apply to our understanding of COVID-19 today? And what lessons are there to be learned from other countries in terms of their responses to COVID-19? For our audience, they might not be aware of the fact that there is sort of a thread in terms of our research, sort of for some of us being really linked to doing medical anthropology research with HIV and AIDS. And I see the similarities with the exception of sort of the stigma associated with having this particular disease. And I wonder from you guys, what what lessons learned from the HIV epidemic could we apply to COVID-19, or what lessons are there to be learned from other countries' responses to COVID-19?
I'm interested in particular in the origins of infectious diseases, particularly the zoonotic origins of infectious diseases, how infectious diseases of people come from animal reservoirs, and the ecological and the political and the social uh, contingencies that permit the spillover, the initial entry of an infectious disease into a human population, and then the amplification. I think there are a bunch of interesting parallels with HIV and COVID-19. 85% of all infectious diseases of humans or thereabouts are zoonotic in origin. They come from animal sources. And so thinking about the circumstances under which we come into contact with possible reservoirs is an important part of the way we should think about future. I mean, it's too late now. It's a proper, COVID-19 is a proper epidemic of humans, right? And we should focus on the human component. Probably this won't be our last rodeo. We will have more spillovers and more emerging infectious diseases in the future. And so thinking about where these things come from is an important part of our our response. I think that the conditions that favored the adaptation of HIV-1 in particular to its new host, meaning humans, are inextricably linked to colonialism and the brutal extractive economies and the rampant dehumanization that took place in early 20th century Central Africa. I think that this is another theme of emerging infectious diseases, is that they often emerge in places where that are marked by extreme degrees of social inequality, and they're amplified by the conditions, and the pathogen is allowed to adapt to transmission in a new host. Because bear in mind that, you know, when a disease first spills over, it's not particularly well adapted to transmission within its new host, right? It takes a while for it to sort of adapt to this new system. And we actually do a pretty good job sometimes of engineering systems for adaptation that have to do with you know, the conditions of colonialism and of these sort of brutal extractive economies, that sort of thing. So does that apply to COVID-19? I'm not so sure. We don't really know the gory details of the spillover yet, but this is something that I think we need to bear in mind in general. I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from a bunch of different infections. I don't know how long you want me to go. Should I stop?
I think folks we're each going to take about like 4 minutes. But I wanted to sort of push you a little bit, because
Yeah.
I remember there being a moment in terms of the early AIDS epidemic, in terms of talking about bushmeat and
Yeah.
sort of really putting down sort of African culture and society in terms of this barbarian, like, sort of, you know, behavior, and,
Yeah.
you know, in eating raw meat and cannibalism, with also a lot of, I think, racist sort of undertones about sort of diet in China. And so I don't know. I mean, you're absolutely right to link in terms of the broader deep science around sort of zoonotic pathogens. But I'm really happy that you're on the panel, because.
Well, they're interesting. They're interesting parallels in that regard. You're absolutely right. John Cornyn, the senior senator from Texas, engaged in some rather severe blaming of Chinese dietary practices. He said something about eating snakes. Meanwhile, of course, every year in various Texas towns and cities, there is the rattlesnake roundup, in which, and I showed this in class.
And scorpions.
Yeah, right. So, and in fact, you know, the snakes are skinned and eaten and prepared in an environment that looks every bit like a wet market. Look, the thing is that people engage in livelihood behavior everywhere, right? And there are things that we do that are fundamentally risky in terms of disease transmission in our livelihood-based behaviors everywhere. What the difference, right? The fundamental difference between the hundreds, possibly thousands of times that humans were infected with retroviruses in Central Africa because of foraging practices, and the emergence of HIV-1 is about the conditions that allowed for the amplification and the adaptation, right? And that's all about the Congo Free State. It's all about the colonial regime that's built in there that basically engineered the environment to allow it to emerge, right? People hunt all over the world. People do things that seem gross to other people, right? In a cross-cultural context, all over the world, that put them at danger. What matters is the conditions that permit the thing to get from, you know, the bush, as it were, into the broader global circulation.
Thank you so much. Professor Lindenbaum,
Yes.
do you have any thoughts in terms of lessons learned from the HIV epidemic, or perhaps some things that we should be mindful of in terms of other countries' responses to this pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic?
I have worked with HIV/AIDS in the past, and also with cholera in Bangladesh. But for many decades now, I've been working on another epidemic, and that is in Papua New Guinea. with the Kuru epidemic. So in contrast to what's being said, you know, in other people's answers, I'll tend to be say what's similar and what's different about the Kuru epidemic more than I'll be referring to the other two. And I've got my notes written down so I don't fly away off text. So here I go. The unexpected emergence of AIDS in the early 1980s, which signaled the return of the industrialized nations to what we had assumed was a vanished world of infectious disease, drew anthropologists and others to consider the nature of epidemics. The AIDS epidemic led many scholars to compare it to past epidemics, especially the bubonic plague called the Black Death in Europe. The Black Death is said to have contributed to the emergence of nation states, the rise of mercantile economies, and the religious movements that led to the Reformation. It may also have brought about the new ways of understanding God, the meaning of death, and the role of authority in religious and social life. Cholera induced a public health approach to stressed quarantine, and venereal diseases led to contact tracing. What's the likelihood that the current epidemic will result in one or another of these grand responses? This is a question that's difficult to answer with any certainty right now because many of us are troubled by the thought that we have been watching how modern democracy can die in other places, and we fear that the authoritarian rule may be just around the corner. We are concerned by the recent choice between health and the right to vote. Fortunately, Amy Klobuchar and Senator Ron Wyden are sponsors of a bill that would allow citizens to vote by mail, an option available in some form in 5 states. So there's evidence that some of our institutions are holding the fort. Trump's unconstitutional claim of total authority over states' rights has been resisted by some governors and politicians on both the right and the left. A recent New York Times article said that the American democracy may be dying. Some of us felt it was already fractured based on social inequalities, the dimensions of which we had not fully acknowledged, but the virus has brought these into full view. We know about the greater death toll in Black and Hispanic communities and in poor immigrant communities where good health care is absent and testing is also rare. We more clearly see now that our democracy was already broken or is in the process of breaking. We have also been alerted by lawyers at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU who examined the contents of the Presidential Emergency Action documents. They tell us that the most notable aspect of the documents might be their secrecy. The documents have managed to escape democratic oversight for 70 years and that Congress should move quickly to address the omission. Historians tell us that extreme economic inequality has never shrunk in a meaningful way without a major crisis. In the context of the current crisis, it may be possible to do something about our current social inequalities. Many of the overlooked people are now called essential workers who keep all of us safe and who also keep the economy afloat. President Franklin Roosevelt is said to have responded to the Great Depression not merely by pumping money into the economy, but by rewriting the rules of the marketplace. His administration enshrined the rights of workers to bargain collectively, imposed strict rules and regulations on the financial industry, and created Social Security to provide pensions for the elderly and disabled. The coronavirus pandemic has laid bare the incomplete nature of the American project. As in earlier plagues, however, it might be possible to shift the balance between the rich and the poor. Also, a strong public health system is the best guarantor of good health, and addressing climate change is a big enough idea to revive the economy. COVID-19 has taught us that our health and safety depend on collective action, and a national survey finds that solidarity is rising. The election offers us a way to ensure that these ideas are put into action. Perhaps our experience with COVID-19 will change our attitudes about preventing infectious disease. An investment in both research and emergency preparedness would have prevented some of the human loss we are now experiencing, and the economic crash as well. As molecular biologists have told us, we live in evolutionary competition with bacteria and viruses, and we may not always be the survivors. And that is why the next election is so important.
Thank you so much, Professor. Now, Professor Sangaramuthi.
I'm also speaking from notes. So my perspective on this question really comes from my experiences studying social and cultural contexts of infectious disease outbreaks. I work particularly on HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis. So first, it's important to note that HIV and COVID-19 are very different in terms of pathogenic agents, transmission, prevention, and social responses. But AIDS is also a global issue that still impacts millions of lives, and it evokes familiarity in terms of emotions like anxiety and anguish, as well as social factors that affected public and institutional responses. So for me, there are really three sort of key similarities that I want to kind of discuss here. A key similarity between the two is really about fear and contagion. What seems very familiar is that the fear of invisible viruses is very reflective of fear and blame of people who are also seen as very different. We see this in the early years of the HIV epidemic, and even now, fear and discrimination towards those who are disproportionately impacted drove public and institutional responses. So for instance, in the US, people lost their jobs, children were kicked out of school, public pools were drained, and dead bodies stacked up in hospitals because there weren't enough beds or staff to treat them. Those from Haiti and Africa were blamed for bringing the virus to Western countries, fueling existing Western racism and further cementing notions of Black bodies as inherently diseased and feared. These forms of violence, discrimination, neglect, racism, and xenophobia are what we're seeing now in some of the responses to the coronavirus. As the disease progresses and becomes much more concentrated in already marginalized communities, it's important to remember how fear and deep-rooted ideas about contagion can play a powerful role in propagating stigma and discrimination towards groups who are seen as unworthy or not as deserving as others. This isn't simply about public perception, it's also about institutionally sanctioned neglect and structural racism, and how certain people are more likely to suffer as a result of ongoing and emerging policies and practices that continue to intensify global inequalities, poverty, and exclusion. So this brings me to my second point. Epidemics flow quickly towards pre-existing disparities along racial, class, and gendered lines. HIV was a disease that we often associated with gay men or people who use drugs. It's now ravaged a whole host of various different kinds of global communities. The impact of historical and continuing legacies of oppression and discrimination paved the way for HIV to disproportionately impact marginalized communities. Today, most individuals living with HIV don't have access to prevention care and treatment. Women, sex workers, men who have sex with men, transgender persons, those who engage in drug use, migrants and refugees continue to face discrimination, stigma, and lack of access to information, testing, and treatment due to various policies and practices that continue to uphold structural and social barriers. We can expect, I think, COVID-19 to flow through some of these similar structures. We are quickly learning that it's impacting marginalized communities much more and much longer, not just in terms of health impacts, but also in terms of severe social and economic impacts. Finally, I think it's important to note that we have seen the power of the state deployed in various different contexts at an unprecedented scale. Travel bans, closures, social distancing, and quarantines. And these are definitely necessary and effective public health prevention responses. But we've also witnessed unprecedented levels of government inaction, much like we've seen in previous epidemics. In the US, we're witnessing issues with a lack of testing, a lack of information, a lack of protective gear, and health system overload. These are issues that I think really derive from decades of underfunding our public health systems by billions of dollars. Our public health financing structure, in my opinion, is essentially broken. That's led the CDC and state and local health departments woefully unprepared to address public health emergencies such as COVID-19. In 2017, public health represented just 2.5% of all healthcare spending in this country. These issues, along with others, deeply impact the ability of public health to actually prevent risk or to respond to health emergencies in a timely manner.
You nailed it. That was awesome. Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite Professor Singer to share with us your thoughts.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank the organizers for putting this together. If I would identify one key lesson that applies as much from HIV, but also other pandemics, Zika, SARS, etc. It's that anthropological, medical anthropology model of biosocial health is key to understanding COVID. You can't really understand the COVID pandemic without understanding, as Becca just pointed out, the social parts that are very much as much a part as this, what I would certainly label syndemic, as HIV or any of the other pandemics we've seen recently. We have to understand the social components in interaction with the biological ones, from bat behavior, if bats are the ultimate source, to the nature of the virus itself and how the virus interacts with the human body, how it came, as James pointed out, to be adapted to living in human bodies, which was not its original host, and obviously to cause great damage. We should remember in bats, coronaviruses don't tend to be a problem because they're a very different creature that, because of don't have the hyperimmune response to the virus that we do. So that all of that biology is important, but the social factors are no less. If we think about some other parallels or lessons learned, we know that travel has played an important feature in the global spread of HIV. And certainly that's the case with Corona. There was a 2013 study that found that in 2012, 2,000 airlines around the world that were operating in 3,700 airports, offering 28 million scheduled flights per year, transporting 2 billion people. As my colleague in Australia, Hans Behr, would point out, because of his strong concern about flight and global warming. And so we know that travel has played an important part in making this a global pandemic from wherever the initial cases were, probably in China, of course. As has been pointed out, social inequality is a fundamental parallel between HIV and COVID. The Director General recently stated, if I can quote him, "COVID does not discriminate between rich nations and poor nations, large nations and small. It does not discriminate between nationalities, ethnicities, or ideologies." While the COVID virus may not discriminate, the COVID syndemic and the HIV syndemic definitely does discriminate in the sense of who feels the absolute worst impact of both of those pandemics. And of course, we know that the comorbid diseases that form the important bio context for what the pandemic is. That is, you can't, any more than you could have understood the HIV pandemic without a consideration of other diseases with which HIV interacted in adverse forms, making them worse or them making HIV worse or both. The same applies with COVID. Think about COVID without comorbidities. It's a very different pandemic. So those comorbidities, where they come from, the social factors that contribute to them, the ecological factors, the role of pollution in creating lung disease, so the origins of global pollution and the fact that it's getting worse, are critical to understanding the syndemic beyond the biology. So there are multiple parallels and differences, as we've all kind of pointed out. We learn from past epidemics and to try and better understand, but obviously all of us are grappling with how to make sense of what's going on, what's driving this beyond the surface things that we've heard about. And that's, I think, what anthropologists are going to be struggling with for a long time.
Thank you so much, sir. And finally, Professor Bhootish.
Hi, thank you all so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have a chance to speak with these panelists and to everyone in the audience. So I would like to start my comments by turning to the contemporary. It seems to me that many of us who are in the US have been following sort of the same sets of stories about what's happening as COVID-19 unrolls. When we look at success stories, we're talking about New Zealand or South Korea. And when we think about social responses, there are a handful of social responses, people making their own masks or standing on their patios and clapping, that we hear over and over again. So I wanted to start my comments by highlighting what is so far a success case that hasn't received a lot of media attention, and that is Paraguay. It's a small, landlocked, middle-income country that has the best record so far in Latin America on COVID-19. It's only had 208 cases and 8 deaths. Part of this is owing to President Abdo's listening to his public health advisors very early on and shutting down the country completely early on. But there are some interesting cultural phenomena that I wanted to highlight that are supporting this. So one is the way that people are supporting formal messaging through the government. One example, in Encarnacion, which is a beautiful city in the south of Paraguay, where I've worked for 10 years, a popular sports show called Paraná Deportivo was asked to go off the air because they no longer had any sports games to cover. There were no soccer games. And what they decided to do instead was to transition to interviewing current professional soccer players and ex-professional soccer players around the world who are in different countries and asking them what's working in that country's COVID-19 response, and then reinforcing those messages to listeners. So that's one example. Another example is through popular music. There's a very famous song in Paraguay, Trece Tuyuti. It means 13th Regiment. It was a Paraguayan polka that was popularized during the Chaco War. And the song is in the indigenous national language, Guarani, which, if you're a Paraguayan, has a sense of authenticity and belonging. And so someone changed that song to say Bata Moreti, which means white lab coat. And it became a song that pays tribute to frontline health workers, but also really strongly emphasizes the unfair inequalities and economic injustices those frontline healthcare workers face in combating COVID-19. And then the last one is one that we are seeing a little bit in other places, but I think it's an important one to highlight, which is the Olla Popular, or community kitchens. So these are groundswells of community members banding together, everyone donating ingredients, cooking food, and addressing the severe food insecurity that we see emerging as a result of lockdowns all over the world. And in some cases, this is done through neighborhood associations or through existing social clubs, and it supplements the food insecurity assistance that already exists in the Paraguayan public healthcare system. So from that, I want to turn to a couple of comments of how we can draw from past epidemics to learn what might happen in the future. A few months ago, I published with Dr. Alex Brewis at ASU, Lazy, Crazy, Disgusting, Stigma, and the Undoing of Global Health. And one of the very strong findings that emerged from our research is that we should expect stigma to emerge in all contemporary epidemics and pandemics. We know that stigma attaches to people who get sick, to their caregivers, to their doctors, and their other healthcare providers. So a good example of this was in the MERS outbreak in Saudi Arabia. we know that stigma attaches to people who are already victimized, marginalized, or minoritized, especially racial and ethnic groups. And that finding is a very classic one. For example, the work coming out of the 1990s cholera epidemic in Latin America, Marilyn Nation's work in Brazil, or the Briggs work in Venezuela. And then the last thing, and one that Dr. Bruce and I have been really trying to emphasize in the press that we've done, is that stigma is always a tool used to seize and entrench power, always. So in our book, we talked about the example of how the Hawaiian Public Health Board used leprosy control as a pretext to suppress dissent and colonize Hawaii. But for every epidemic, you can look at these patterns. It's a reliable feature of pandemics, so that means we need to look for it, be ready for it, and ready to push back against it. And there are simple things that people can do. For example, my colleague, Dr. Cindy Sorcerethren, reminded me, we can do this by shifting our language. We can try not to use war metaphors, although I used one by saying combating about 2 minutes ago. Sorry, it's not as easy as it sounds. We can try not to use war metaphors, and we can also try not to give the virus agency, but rather, as all of the panelists have done, point to the ways that human societies create unjust and racist systems that produce inequities in healthcare.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you so much. You know, thinking about, before we go on to our next question, thinking about what Amber just shared in terms of some of the successes, I can't help but be reminded in terms of what is happening here in Brooklyn, and the fact that so much of our public health messaging was mostly accessible on the internet, and it was all textual. And the fact that the president of Paraguay recognized that sort of having people verbally communicate this information was a powerful vehicle to be able to disseminate just basic information around hygiene, around social distancing, et cetera. And I'm frankly a little bit disappointed that most of our resources from CDC and from WHO, et cetera, were mostly textual, and that we needed, especially here in New York, that we need to recognize that that's a huge barrier to getting information. Not everyone has the internet, and there is also the barrier of low literacy. And so I think that our responses has been challenged by that. And I think also the overwhelming biomedical nature of this pandemic has really pushed public health to the side. And I understand that. I work at a medical center, and I understand and am fighting every day to try to get them to understand that it's not just what happens when someone comes into the door in terms of doing everything they can to save lives, but it's the messaging that we need to take out to the community. And so I thank all of you guys for starting us off. It feels like a perfect sort of segue then into talking, and so many of you talked about social inequalities and injustice being sort of at the heart of why we're seeing, in particular, sort of real disproportionate number of Black and brown people suffer or have extremely poor health outcomes. And just as Professor Singer mentioned, the virus does not discriminate. It's gotten the heads of states, royals, famous actors, musicians, news correspondents. However, just like HIV, we see over time that the health impacts do. And it's because of these underlying inequalities that I think have been really brought to light. And I think Professor Lindemann also mentioned about the invisibility of our essential workers, that we never paid any attention to that clerk or to that subway driver, but now we do. So my question, thinking about the gross inequalities and social economic inequalities related or that have been brought to fore around the coronavirus pandemic and our response, my question is, how can we move beyond doing albeit necessary, the research to identify or confirm these perennial social determinants of health that contribute to the disproportionate COVID-19 mortality rates among racial and ethnic minorities? How do we use our scholarship to get social and economic justice for our Black and Brown communities and those invisible populations? And so to start us off, I have a new cue. Oh, Christmas. I would like to start off with Professor Singer.
The famous pathologist Rudolf Virchow is often cited by medical anthropologists, especially critical medical anthropologists, because of his assertion that social justice should be a central theme in medical practice. And I think we could say the same about medical anthropology, that it needs to be a central theme always in the work we do as medical anthropologists. Because as we've all now mentioned, pandemics like COVID expose the both overt and often covert or less well-known lines of local, national, and global interlinked health and social injustice and structural violence. We know that global healthcare and health inequalities are especially concentrated in low-income countries, but we also know that there are significant inequalities in healthcare, in health, and in health access in wealthy nations, especially among discriminated against ethnic minorities, other stigmatized groups like the injection drug users that I was involved in studying for many years, and of course the poor. But why is this the case? I mean, we all know this is the case, but why is it the case? How is it that inequality is maintained under the banner of a liberty and justice for all system? That's what we say. That's what we say we even want for the whole world. And yet, decade after decade, these inequalities continue. And that's because, of course, they're beneficial for some people to have inequalities. Not the people on the pointed end of inequalities, but the people who hold the stick. In the United States, which of course is a very wealthy nation, for example, just to take one example, the number of hospital beds is lower per capita than in most high-income countries. Now, why should such a wealthy nation, with, as we're told very often, has the best healthcare system in the world, have such a relatively low number of health beds, which was, of course, highlighted in this pandemic? And in fact, it reflects the history of reliance on market-driven healthcare system. People who can pay the most shape the availability of services, and those who don't pay, can't pay, don't get those services. We know, and it's often been repeated again during the pandemic, that about 10%, and by some calculations, more of our population in the US do not have health insurance, and literally about half are underinsured, so they're not covered for vitally important things. Why is this tolerated? Why does it continue? We talk about it, we hear about it, but nothing radically changes about it. And of course, it gets magnified in the pandemic because people without financial ability to access healthcare have to make the decision to go without it. Just to take one example, in the US, St. John Parish, which straddles the Mississippi River and locationally, health-wise, and poverty-wise and ethnically, is much like the nearby predominantly African-American parish where I did field work a number of years ago on environmental health. The parish has about 43,000 people, but it also has a large number of chemical plants and oil refineries, which have been cited multiple times for pollution. They are owned by and run by the polluting elites. Because of their pollution, environmental activists have dubbed St. John and its neighboring river parishes Cancer Alley. And the parish also has the highest death rate per capita for coronavirus in the country, according to an analysis by the New York Times. So this is not a coincidence that these two would flow together. St. John's Parish passes some of the urban hotspots in the pandemic that have gotten a lot of attention. So clearly we see in St. John's a microcosm of what's wrong. And anthropology, I think, should be in large part, not the only role, but certainly a strong role of exposing and the socially embedded aspects of structural violence and the role of such social arrangements in maintaining social systems and creating grave health disparities.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Our next panelist for this second question is Professor Sangaramuthi.
Okay, so first I want to say that I do think it's really important to understand from multiple perspectives that for many people in the US and globally, COVID-19, like other conditions, is part of the broader context of inequity and suffering. I think we need to think about COVID-19 as an enduring crisis rather than a phenomenon that we can just move beyond. Yet I also want to emphasize that oftentimes we tend to overlook our own misrecognition of the political framing of crisis. We tend to think of infectious disease outbreaks as discrete, extraordinary events. I think it's equally important to engage in recognizing them as ordinary, in that what we're witnessing are spectacular instantiations of enduring injustice at multiple scales. As such, I think we need to not only trace and document issues related to the social context of COVID-19 health disparities, but also understand how disparities are not an anomaly, but rather systemic, productive, generative, and valuable to the operation of governing bodies and the management of populations. In other words, I think it's really important to understand how social inequities and health systems are really co-produced or co-constituted with each other. There have been increasing public and academic discussions around the disproportionate health impacts of COVID-19 on populations who are already vulnerable, but very little of this discussion focuses on how certain social and cultural norms around health disparities, values about the differences between certain bodies and social groups, and health and welfare structures were in existence long before COVID-19. Therefore, I think it's important not only to focus on the health and social impacts of COVID-19 on certain communities, but also on how particular norms, values, structures, and institutions themselves perpetuate these inequities, rendering them as natural or normal. I'd like to see more work on how notions of difference and disparities are made meaningful by discourses, practices, and structures that are supposed to protect us, and how they intersect with norms and values around efficiency, productivity, profit, and social control. Further, I think scholarship and activism targeted at looking at these issues at the level of health systems, globalized political economies, and local governance is really important. Before I discuss the role of public health financing on institutional responses to global crisis, more work on health policy and funding to help us understand how systems are highly dependent on major health threats of the moment, political shifts, and economic realities would be really useful. Also, research on the culture of public health institutions, I think, is really critical. I think we're well equipped to understand that local culture plays a role in managing epidemics, but I think more attention is needed to understand institutional culture and how that impacts local context and responses to health emergencies. Finally, I think crises like this must also be understood in their historical context, and in particular, in relation to empire building and racial projects. Legacies of transatlantic slave trade, European and US colonialism in all its forms, post-colonial aid dependency, and civil unrest have contributed not only to the patterns of disease transmission, but also to earlier failures of government and international actors to mount coordinated responses. This work can be incredibly helpful in thinking through the present moment, but it will also help us reimagine a more just future.
Thank you so much. And now we're getting lots of cool questions. Professor Bhootish?
When we received our questions from Dr. Taylor, I understood the emphasis of this question to be, how can we move beyond the essential work of documenting health disparities and toward activism, which I think is a very, very important question. So that's the one that I want to address. And I'll start this by saying that I started, little known fact, I started my career as an activist working in the Red Stocking movement and focused on women's healthcare. And I soon learned that I was not destined to be a great or even successful activist because it's very hard and I was not good at it. So I have the utmost respect for the work that activists do, and I would never claim to be doing that in my own work because I know what real activism looks like. At the same time that I was realizing that I was a failure as an activist, my Russ Bernard told me that the greatest impact he'd had in his career was as a teacher through his students. And with the arrogance of youth, I thought, how sad. But now that I'm on the other end of the continuum, I see that the largest impact I myself have had on the world is through my own students. And so I think from those of us who are coming from a perspective of scholarship, we're in the academy, we really need to think about how do we use our teaching to empower and embolden our students to make the amazing impacts on the world that they're so passionate to do. And so, for example, at Arizona State University, we are in Arizona, and one of my colleagues, a professor of Latino history, Matt Garcia, once told me Arizona is to the immigrants' rights movement what Mississippi is to the civil rights movement. And so for us on the border in Arizona, immigrant rights is really the core of what we're focused on. And I have over the years been so proud of the work that our students have done through the organization No More Deaths. It's an incredibly important organization that's fighting for the lives of people immigrating over the border. Many, many of our students and even our colleagues, people in our faith communities have worked in this organization. So just a highlight of what they're doing. You may know them because their position has been providing life-saving humanitarian aid is not a crime. And one of their members had a very high-profile arrest for putting water out for immigrants. Right now, they're calling for more testing in detention. They're calling for the release of immigrants who are in detention because of the risk of COVID-19. They're calling for a stop to Border Patrol enforcement because they cannot provide safe conditions for people who are in detention. And they're providing legal clinics for emergency bond funds, and they're accepting donations for people who are doing that. And this, to me, is a really powerful example of how we can partner with our students and people in our community to make really important change where we are, right? Beyond that, I would just say that everyone who's a working anthropologist has a moral obligation to pay attention to, support, and amplify the needs and the views of the frontline communities that they work with. This can be easier said than done, and one of my own personal heroes and someone whose work I follow very closely is Miriam Kaba, who is a leader in the United States of the prison abolition movement, which I believe is one of the most important movements in activism to shift the US to a more just system. She says that people who are interested in helping need to figure out who's on the ground doing the work, what resources exist so you can educate yourself without burdening people who are doing the activism, figure out what capacity you have to help and support people doing that work, and figure out how you can contribute constructively. And that's something I think that we can all do in the communities where we're located and through the networks we make in our scholarship.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so happy that you mentioned the brown detained immigrants and asylum seekers at our border or in ICE detention centers that are being exposed to COVID-19, or even the contradiction, the hypocrisy in terms of sort of our Black and brown people who are incarcerated. I find it really despicable that in the last couple of weeks that Michael Cohen has gotten out of jail, or Michael Avenatti, a mobster, Roger Stone is making sort of, efforts to try to get out of jail, but Bill Cosby and R. Kelly, both despicable people, are not. And I found that very interesting, that no one is really focusing on that particular population in terms of our incarcerated people being at risk of COVID-19. Professor Lindenbaum?
Okay. I think on social justice, race, and social inequality, I think I dealt with those topics in my last discussion, and I want to turn now to how people responded to an epidemic in a society without stratification by social class. And we see how the epidemic here was both similar and different to COVID-19. During the Kuru epidemic, the Fore people in Papua New Guinea, where I did field work, were aware of the full dimension of the problem. In the early 1960s, at the height of the epidemic, they held public meetings throughout the whole of the Fore, almost every day for several months. Local leaders traveled to other communities where they spoke to the assembled crowd, pleading with the sorcerers present to give up their evil ways. They understood that the government said that Kuru was a form of sickness not caused by sorcery, but they were not convinced. These daily meetings provided them, however, with an accurate measure of the devastation and demographic information that would rival a government census. The orators also said that they would test whether or not sorcerers were killing their women. Women were the main victims of the disease, which had been transmitted by the consumption of the dead during mortuary ceremonies, by women who were the main consumers of the dead. The orators described a test that they would impose on all men. They said they would send the men away to a very hard place where they would suffer privations. And if during that time new cases of Kuru didn't arise, it was proof that male sorcerers were the root of the problem. This is what epidemiologists would call a controlled trial, based on faulty assumption about the nature of the disease, of course, but an example of epidemiological thinking. I should add also that Kuru and the coronavirus epidemics are different in significant ways. One big difference is that the first case of Kuru seems to have occurred sometime around the turn of the century in the 1890s in the North Fore, where they were adjacent to a different linguistic group. The first case may have originated with a spontaneous genetic change in which one person had acquired the infectious agent, now called a prion, which is not a virus or a bacteria, but a misfolded protein, a new scientific object, which was earlier identified by Stanley Prusner, who received a Nobel Prize for this finding in 1997. The prion was then transmitted to a small group of women who consumed that person in their mortuary ceremonies. That small group then died and were eaten, and the epidemic traveled from north to south, the number of Kuru cases increasing, reaching the South Fore, where Robert Glass and I had our field house and witnessed the height of the epidemic in the early 1960s. So the Fore had some decades to construct and confirm their own understanding of disease without contradictory information. It should be noted also that Kuru was infectious, not contagious. It could only be transmitted by cannibalism. The idea that the disease was transmitted by cannibalism was one proposed by Robert Glass and myself in the early 1960s, but the medical establishment did not adopt it until their own epidemiological evidence showed in 1968 that no one born after 1960 had come down with the disease. Cannibalism had ended in the late 1950s when the government and missionaries said that people should not eat the dead, at a time when the cause was unknown. So medicine did not put an end to the epidemic either. Science comes into its own later, however, with the contributions of investigators from the Prion Institute in London, using bloods collected by Jerome Whitfield, a medical anthropologist and a member of the Prion unit, who collected blood samples from the Fore and adjacent people, which included some blood from a few Fore women who we knew had consumed the dead but had survived. The Prion unit then showed that these rare cases had a genetic adaptation that protected them against the infectious agent. They published 2 papers, 2003, 2009, in which they said that these surviving women had provided a recent case of Darwinian evolution. Then in 2015, the unit confirmed that cannibalism had been the mode of transmission using poor little laboratory mice. But you know, they used to use chimpanzees, so I suppose that's an improvement. Well, it's different anyway. The study also suggested that if transmission had continued with cannibalism, the epicenter of the affected region might have been repopulated with Kuru-resistant individuals as a result of population genetic response to the epidemic. This is the concept of herd immunity, the bad suggestion discussed during the early days of the pandemic. This was not considered here at all, not considered among the four at all. In sum, the Kuru story shows the importance of an interdisciplinary approach to the investigation of disease. It also confirms the importance of science, sometimes discounted during the coronavirus epidemic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Professor Jones?
Yeah, I've been debating, I have two different answers prepared, and I've been debating which one to talk about. So, but I think I'm going to talk about something a little different, which, because, you know, as I look around at my colleagues here, everybody is so incredibly qualified to talk about health inequalities. I'm going to talk a little bit about science and the politics and social organizations surrounding our response to crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's just be frank about it, we were caught with our pants down, in part because of quite active efforts on the part of certain political groups to undermine and reduce the effectiveness of government and other institutions that can contribute to the management of crises like a pandemic. And these types of institutions, in addition to government, include universities and research organizations. There's a political project afoot, and there's a pervasive, I mean, what I for lack of a better term, I'd call a neoliberal logic that holds that huge profits can be made when tiny comparative advantages arising from small differences in efficiencies are leveraged over very large scales, right? This is the economic model of globalization. And so because you can leverage these small efficiencies for these huge profits, there's a constant drive to increase efficiency in our production systems and in our institutions and that sort of thing. The problem with this type of efficiency, in the sense of leanness, the sort that leads to cost differentials because of variations in efficiency, is that it's absolutely the last thing you want in times of crisis. Thinking about our optimal production systems, our optimal government capacities, our social organizations for dealing with crises, looks very different when we're trying to maximize a mean value of something, for example, a profit, versus trying to manage systemic risk. We've turned the logic of profit maximization, or if you like, cost minimization, to domains where it simply doesn't belong: education, research and development, public health, and healthcare more generally. Thinking in a more risk-aware terms means moving beyond means and thinking more fully about distributions. Variance is a good place to start, but there's more to distributions than just variance. We know from a ton of really exciting ongoing research in diverse areas that diverse systems are more responsive to change than our homogeneous systems. This is a fact. It's a hallmark of evolution, right? The rate of adaptation is proportional to the variance in fitness. It's called Fisher's fundamental theorem. It's what makes markets work. It's where the efficiencies of markets come from. There has to be diversity in them. Diverse teams are better at problem solving. Diverse companies, in terms of the composition of their boards, in terms of who runs their organization, turn higher profits in innovation-driven sectors. The problem is that the continual drive to improve efficiency means that we suppress diversity and we leave ourselves vulnerable to these crises, to these times of change. When there are consequential tail events, so events, if you imagine a probability distribution, something way out in the far extreme of a distribution, like a pandemic is, we need to value diversity. We need to value diversity in opinions and in institutions, in government responses, and in science. There's so much pressure for research to be immediately relevant. Funders want to support work that will lead to direct solutions, but that's not the way science works. Congressional oversight committees, I'm thinking about Lamar Smith when he was the head of the Congressional Science Committee, they belittle research that sounds obscure, exotic, or frivolous. When Lamar Smith put together his list of shame, his 10 most ridiculous sounding NSF proposals that were funded, about 8 of them were anthropology proposals, and the other 2 were geography, okay? So people look at what we do and they think that's absolutely frivolous and ridiculous. But the deal is, you don't know where these tail events are going to come from. You don't know what part of the world, you don't know what kind of event they're going to be, you don't know what type of expertise and what type of capacity you need. And that's why we need to build more capacity for dealing with crises. And why we really, I think we need to promote diversity in all of our institutions, because that's what's going to get us through the next crisis. It's going to get us through this crisis as well. I'll stop there. I have a lot.
No, I totally get that. Just so our panelists know, I think I'm going to pause before we go on to our third question. But and we're going to basically field some of the questions that are coming from our audience. But I just want to say, James, I think you're really right. And I don't think that we completely got caught with our pants down, because I think that there have been a lot of us. I will just speak for myself. I'm faculty in a division of infectious disease. I'm in a medical center. And I think that there's something very unique about this particular virus, or maybe the nature. It has been so driven by the biomedical, and I feel like my public health colleagues and myself, we've been clamoring on the side for months and months and months that, like, it's really the public health people. And don't get me wrong, I pray every day for my colleagues to be safe, that are working 8 blocks from here, that have like shipped their families away out of state. One colleague who just had a baby boy, he's missing all the first. And there's something about this in terms of sort of how public health was really silenced, and I believe that firmly. And there's a hierarchy, and there's folks whose voices are being privileged over others. And I don't want our audience to think that I'm not talking about getting PPE and prioritizing the safety of our health workers and our first responders, but there was a complete ignorance on the fact that, like, this is not all happening inside the emergency room, that there was a whole world of inequality out there, and we knew it was coming. We knew. Okay, so I've got some great questions for all of the panelists. I'm not sure, I would really kind of encourage people to just sort of jump in. The first question, and these are sort of questions that are kind of an amalgam of lots of questions that have been put together. So where do we see anthropology and its role in the tension between overwhelming amounts of information and disinformation? What practical strategies can we envision for countering stigma and misinformation?
Great question. So I'll start first with the part of countering stigma. So with regard to countering stigma, Alex Bruce and I believe that the most effective thing we can do is partner with frontline affected communities, listen to what they're saying the problems are, and to the extent that we can, throw our voices behind them and lift them up. And then also an incredibly important element of that lifting up is to get advocates, so people who have a high media profile who can help to amplify those voices. So that's step one, and it's something that we can all participate in no matter how small our voices are in our own communities. And one way that we see that I think is so important is that we see millennials and Zoomers who have been denied an equal share of political voice and power in our society, really creating social norms and enforcing them very actively. So this is a kind of culture creation that I find very inspiring. Because when, for example, when people are saying something racist, when people are deviating from social distancing requirements, they are stepping in and saying, this is unacceptable, we refuse to accept it. Some people have called this cancel culture and maligned it in that way, but I think it's really a sort of social movement that is incredibly important in countering stigma and has been quite effective.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in terms of our particular role in terms of addressing some of these circulating discourses that are, you know, feeding? Yes, James?
We are actively trying to study how behavior changes when you have strong divisions in a society. So I've teamed up with an amazing team of young, mostly anthropologists who are interested in studying cultural evolution, and we're looking at the dynamics, because you know these things they develop momentum, they develop inertia, and you can end up going in a very different place than even the people who are engaged in the behavior change probably think that they're going, when you live in a world that's very divided, right? And so we're hoping that through trying to understand how these things can change through time, that we can develop interventions that don't backfire, that are sort of maximally effective. It's a longish process. I mean, we're not going to have anything to say probably for close to a year, but as I said before, I suspect this isn't the last crisis we're ever going to have to deal with. So it seems like good information to have. Yeah.
It looks like we lost Professor Singer, so I would imagine that the folks are trying to get him to come back and join. Professor Lindenbaum, what do you think in terms of anthropology and its role to help mitigate this tension between misinformation and information? It's been a lot to handle for folks, and I understand that it's been challenging.
Well, there's various kinds of misinformation. There's misinformation in the Kuru epidemic that was mainly the result of people, journalists misreading the medical literature, but then people who thought that was such an interesting topic. It had cannibalism, and it was from a faraway place, and it had some skullduggery associated with one of the major investigators. And so, you know, a lot of journalists and comedians and poets and novelists and filmmakers, there were DVDs, and there were musicians writing about it, and it was all filled with misinformation. But there's another kind of misinformation, which I think we're all familiar with, and that is we fall back in dismay at the misinformation in Trump's daily TV performances at the present time, which are not just sloppy or faulty reporting, although they are, or fanciful, but they sometimes are that too, but something much more complex, political messaging directed at his base, willful and reckless, and also something I think we have not yet identified with any certainty, a lack of empathy, perhaps an inability to understand the difference between true and untrue things, something that is discussed from time to time by psychiatrists and linguists and other observers. Trump's contradictory statements and misinformation, however, are much more troubling than the mistellings of the Kuru story. So that's my comment about the kinds of mistellings that we're, you know, there are some that are life and death matters, and there are some that are just idiotic and fanciful and fun.
Yes. Dr. Sangaramuthi?
I'm just gonna, I think the main thing that I really had to say on this issue is that I think I'm sort of enhancing what Shirley's saying, is that it's, you know, this isn't just sort of about public stigma and misinformation. This is something that is also occurring at the highest levels of government. So how do we counter that as scholars in a public way, right? Not just in our scholarship, but in sort of interviews and speeches and our writings. And I think that, you know, I think the more of us who are able to do this, the better it will be. I think there are some people who often are on the front lines of criticizing or speaking truth to power here, for a lack of a better sort of phrase here. And I think that many of us who do this often put ourselves on the line in terms of hate mail or possibly getting the ramifications of speaking out. And oftentimes these are Black and brown scholars. And I think that more people need to speak out against white supremacy. I think that more people do need to make that link between stigma and misinformation, and the role that it does play in propagating, you know, white supremacy at all sorts of different levels.
Yeah, I read somewhere that someone was saying that something about white supremacy being an underlying health condition, or that is one of the reasons why that we are disproportionately being affected, is that we are victims of white supremacy, and this is part of our one of our comorbidities. Another question that has been raised is, what are or might be the consequences of mixed responses at both the local and international levels? Is there a one-size-fits-all response that should be discussed, or are local and national governments, ranging from far left to far right, expected to produce individual responses? So this is, to me, this is very much about sort of the different levels of responses. And we started off kind of talking about the responses both on the federal, global, local level, and how maybe we should really resist the one size fits all. I think Amber's example in terms of sort of what played out in Paraguay is really illustrative of how it needs to be context specific. Does anyone want to chime in terms of thinking about our responses being tailored to particular particular venues, or thinking about sort of the differences in the different levels of responses?
I mean, one of the things we're seeing, particularly with climate change responses, is that it's often cities and smaller units of political organization that are coming up with the most creative and interesting solutions, and that's part of that diversity of response. I think that that's something to bear in mind with this. The one problem, of course, is that suppose you have a municipality or a state of California, for example, state of Washington, that's doing a good job with control. And we drive, the reproduction number of the epidemic down, we get incidence down to zero. The problem is that you're only as secure as, the people with whom you're exchanging people with, right? So if other states are in a bad situation, we can actually see this. I don't need to show it. You can probably imagine it. I have data from Ebola cases in Guinea, where during the 2014-2015 epidemic in West Africa, the number of cases went to zero in Guinea on 2 different occasions, and was rescued by people coming in and reinfecting. So that is something. This is where coordination coordination is something we're absolutely lacking at any sort of broad scale, particularly in the United States. This is where coordination matters, and of course getting our testing ability up to snuff. So on the one hand, I think that having smaller political units, municipalities and states, experimenting is a great thing for finding better solutions, but there is a degree to which coordination and lack thereof is going to lead to an unnecessarily long epidemic if you get reinfection coming from without on a regular basis. Yeah,
a real unknown. I'm waiting to see if we have, okay, so I've been told to move into the final question. And in this final question, I might get a little sort of personal. So our final topic was about wellness. And, you know, thinking about wellness here in Brooklyn, in New York City, that has 30 times more cases and deaths, really made me think about what we're all going through, that individuals, families, and communities here especially, but also around the world, are experiencing a level of trauma, which I believe is profoundly going to impact our mental health and well-being for years. In New York City, we have families that have lost multiple members of their family. There was one famous case in New Jersey in terms of, I think, 4 people or three people dying from one family. And the fact that this virus is so cruel, not allowing us to be able to say goodbye, not allowing loved ones to be able to go into the emergency room and hold the hands of our loved ones, not being able to say goodbye in terms of our rituals of grieving, or rituals, our cultural homegoings. You know, thinking about the many unclaimed bodies that are being buried at Hart Island here in New York. I'm not sure if anywhere else in the country that there's that kind of trauma of knowing that there are New Yorkers that are not being claimed, that are going into a hole. You know, at the beginning of our talk, my phone went off, and I was a little bit embarrassed because I did turn it off. But it was a reminder to get ready so I can go get my tambourine and get my drums and my sons, everyone dressed, and get our mask on to go outside. Because in the midst of all of this trauma and the daily trauma, I've lost neighbors. I've lost 3 neighbors. That also there is this resilience, and that communities are coming together, much like what Amber mentioned in Paraguay, to provide support, whether it's food, etc. And in New York at 7 o'clock, we make a lot of noise, and it's like a permanent reminder on my phone, because it's my only way to see my neighbors and to celebrate our healthcare workers. So in the midst of this grief and sadness, there are some incredible displays of solidarity. You know, 30,000 retired healthcare workers signed up to volunteer in New York City, airplanes full of providers from Atlanta and San Francisco flew here. It's quite incredible. And so I want us to now think about, you know, healing the trauma of COVID-19, the impact of social distancing as social beings, that impact, losing our rituals and our abilities to celebrate lives. What are your thoughts or your prognosis for our health and well-being? How will anthropology help to tell our stories? Fear, anxiety, sadness, loss, anger. Are there cultural or community-based mental health therapies that we should think about using, or should we be emphasizing, to help mitigate the acute and chronic mental distress that will follow from COVID-19? And so these are thoughts to try to think about what's our next step. We're in it right now, but what's our next step? And how can anthropology be a role or play a role in our healing process?
I want to just talk about anthropology first, but then also my personal sort of perspectives on this. I definitely feel like this was a good time for anthropology. I think anthropologists are making really interesting contributions. Like other scholars, I think we have a lot of information that the world needs to know. And then there are these opportunities for us, ongoing opportunities for us to add to national and global conversations about some of these issues that are affecting so many of us, almost all of us. I also do hope that we don't misrecognize enduring systemic failures as discrete time frame crises for the sake of justifying disciplinary relevance. So what I can say from my own perspective, not only as a scholar with specific subject matter expertise in anthropology and public health, but also as an immigrant, a first-generation college student, also as a woman of color in the academy whose work and life are deeply intertwined, that for me, there's been a lot of comfort and hope in bearing witness to the power of communities and accompanying community leaders and advocates and coming together to take care of one another, to act, and to engage in necessary fights around issues that have long been in existence well before COVID-19. So things like universal and meaningful healthcare, abolition, housing rights, equal employment, gender equality, environmental justice, and the rights of marginalized communities, displaced populations, migrants, and immigrants. For instance, COVID-19, like other health and social crises, have really exposed the need for universal health coverage and health financing in the US. We see that by examining other countries' responses to COVID-19, like South Korea, reveals how universal health coverage is such an important foundation to cope with epidemics and health security crises. During the early years of HIV activism, there were similar debates about whether the fight was specific to the immediate saving of lives through research and treatment, or whether the fight was more about tackling all of the various underlying disparities that allowed HIV to thrive. I think since then, various leaders in the US have all called for universal health care or Medicare for all, but in each case, we've really fallen short of that goal. And this crisis, I think, creates another moment for us to change this. And I think it's important for anthropologists to join in this ongoing fight. This is one of the major issues that are really deeply personal to me and that align directly with my own scholarship. I also work alongside community leaders and activists and health and social providers in the field of HIV and immigrant rights who have long refused to accept the status quo, and they've instead created their own forms of care. They've developed healthcare and support organizations, challenged and changed how treatment and services are delivered, and demanded that society and government pay attention and respond. They definitely see this as a necessary, just, moral, and legitimate response to precarity, characterized by economic scarcity, civic inequalities, market-based healthcare, and exclusionary policies. To me, this also shows us how in the face of such precarity, people also find means of relating to each other, connecting to each other, taking care of each other. It shows us how people are reimagining precarity and uncertainty as relational, as generating circuits of social connections and belonging through the care of others. I think it's incredibly important to amplify these spaces and voices, but this also involves deep and sustained and committed action. So what can anthropologists do to better engage during these times? I think we really need to consider what critical engagement actually looks like. What, with whom, and why are we engaging? I think our involvement requires us to move beyond sort of certain romanticization of ethnographic practices and to carefully consider the politics of translation and questions of value within our own work. I think doing so allows us to better align ourselves with those most negatively impacted by unfair policies and to actively participate in community and grassroots coalitions, local and national initiatives, and interdisciplinary collaborations both within and beyond the academy to ensure that our scholarship is, one, recognizable, and two, useful to individuals and communities that are already engaged in the struggle for rights and resources to address their needs.
Thank you. James, Amber?
Yes, I can jump in here. I think that Dr. Sangaramurthy killed it. She gave an amazing answer. So I will just add to it in a couple of tiny ways. One thing that Alex Bruce and I have been really laser focused on since the emergence of COVID-19 is stigma and mental health of healthcare workers. So Dr. Taylor, this is getting back to your initial prompt. For a long time, I have been following the work of Dr. Sarah Matthew, who works on moral injury among veterans of armed conflict. And I was both alarmed, but also gratified to see an MD PhD in our field, Dr. Michelle Mukuyikwa. She came out of your program, I think. You might know her. Yes, she recently pointed out that MDs in the US are beginning to suffer moral injury. And so this is basically a condition that puts people at high risk of depression, anxiety, and PTSD because they have been forced, typically in their professional duties, to do something that violates their basic sense of ethics. And so this was something that Dr. Munyikwa pointed out before the COVID-19 epidemic started, but every frontline report we're seeing from medical workers aligns with this idea that we are going to see skyrocketing depression, anxiety, and PTSD.
Yes, yes.
And so Dr. Bruce and I have been like very much trying to emphasize to all the channels where people listen to us that we need to get in front of this. We need to be ready to provide services. We need to care for those in our community who've cared for us for the very long-term recovery it takes to manage depression, anxiety, and PTSD that results from moral injury. This is a very serious joke, and our healthcare providers need us.
Absolutely. I'm sorry.
Thing that we're focused on, and then the other thing I just wanted to slightly add on to Dr. Sangaramurthy's comments is that it's very clear now that the safety net in the United States is radically inadequate, profoundly inadequate, and particularly around healthcare provision. But I also want to amplify that, and I've heard Dr. Sangaramurthy speak on this before as well, which is that the particular forms of capitalism that we're experiencing now, whether it's racialized capitalism in the United States, or it's a form of neoliberal capitalism that's highly debt dependent in poorer countries, is producing these negative outcomes as well. And so we as anthropologists, and particularly with the work that I do with Dr. Melissa Beresford and the Society for Economic Anthropology, there's enormous expertise in how to build and maintain embedded economies that follow different logics from capitalism. And so we participate in a group particularly focused on water sharing and trying to grow those water sharing economies in underserved communities and informal water sharing systems. But there, I know Dr. Sangaramurthy has worked on health care provision sharing as well. And so I think growing these embedded economies is another way that anthropologists have an opportunity to partner with communities and create spaces of resilience.
James, do you have any thought? This mental health, emphasis on mental health is really important. I feel that our society is completely never taken it seriously in terms of it being behind gun violence and, you know, all kinds of stuff in our society. Do you know how many guns were purchased during this pandemic, in the early part of this pandemic? Over 2 million. It's frightening. And thinking about the fact that our country has never invested in mental health, and thinking about my colleagues, the doctors and the nurses, and having to make these ethical, these horrific choices about who gets the ventilator. I mean, this is going to be lingering for years in terms of what they're seeing, in terms of the social suffering, in terms of people dying by themselves and lonely. James, do you have a thought?
Pretty far afield from my expertise.
Sorry.
Sorry. I mean, I'm just all about trying to build up adaptive capacity afterwards. I think that like putting our pedagogical energy into getting people trained who can help do this work is a really important thing for many anthropologists. That's where I'm going to focus. Yes,
absolutely. Just like Amber, in terms of, I mean, your form of activism through teaching. I think that's, I can't believe you said you're a failed activist. I do not believe it. But I do believe that you are an activist in your teaching. So there's one more sort of future-oriented question. How can anthropology get ahead of the curve and engage with what's coming in the aftermath of this pandemic? Specifically, how might we think about eviction, mounting inequality, environmental racism, mental health malaise, post-traumatic stress disorder. We haven't sort of, I'm glad that Amber chimed in terms of talking about the fragility of our safety net and how in a week we just learned that everyone was a week away from basically bankruptcy and not being able to pay their bills. Loneliness, the ageism that is rendered its ugly head. So how can we get ahead? How can we get ahead and think about sort of the aftermath that's going to be our new normal? You know, we are historically in a moment that is new to all of us, to think about sort of some pivotal event changing and shifting how we are and how we interact with each other. It's a frightening moment. And I think for our particular discipline, it's a moment for us to really focus on what's to come. Please, Amber, continue.
Yeah, I'll just briefly say that one of the things I tried to highlight in my first response is that so much of the public health work that is needed in pandemic prevention is not high tech. It's not even necessarily expensive, although it can be done in expensive and high tech ways. And so when we see a number of, so far, success stories from the Global South, we can see that, you know, there are countries that have nurtured their public health systems and that are succeeding in clamping down on the infection rates. But we also see examples, and I think, so more than half of my family lives in Paraguay. And so what's happening in South America is very personal for me. And I know many people who are listening from South America. Thank you for joining us. And anyone who lives there or has ties there knows that we have suffered a terrible decade in terms of turning back the progress that's been made and expanding social safety nets. And even just the last 5 years have been really horrific. I have deep ties in Bolivia, and it's been very hard to watch the coup and its aftermath in Bolivia. And so at the same time that there are these success stories, we also see, for example, Ecuador, where Guayaquil is experiencing a horrific pandemic. And part of that is rolling back those public health programs, rolling back the funding for public programming. It's devastating, right? And this pandemic goes on, and with the lack of international coordination and the lack of resource shifting across countries that would and should normally be occurring, I have grave fears for low-income countries and how they'll fare during this pandemic.
Yeah, and my research is in Southern and East Africa, and I'm constantly talking to my colleagues in Zimbabwe in terms of, you know, a country that is just politically and economically a mess. I mean, there is no healthcare infrastructure, and thinking about how they will have to employ sort of like community resources to try to provide mental health and other services. Dr. Lindenbaum, I would love for you to share with us your question at this point. It's all you.
I prepared the third response to the general question of social community responses, and it's a bit of a shout out for anthropology, and so it's sort of what people have been saying in response to the questions. Are sort of seeded in some of the thoughts here. And it's not just, I'm going to talk about Papua New Guinea and the South Pacific mostly, but it's just because it's a faraway place and about documenting the epidemic in faraway places and anthropology's role in that. So this is what I had in mind. Anthropologists are well placed to provide unique information about the response to the epidemic in faraway places. And it's very diverse in many faraway places. Many of us who are still in contact with the people we lived with, and in your case also, and who now have access to the internet. The coronavirus is still heading toward the South Pacific, so a full account of the impact of the pandemic will be recorded in the months to come. Preliminary information suggests that people are receiving current information about the virus depending on where they live. I'm in touch with two foreign men, one in Port Moresby on the coast, and the other still in the Highlands, who I've known since they were little kids. They are both receiving good information about the pandemic on television and newspapers on the coast and through their cell phone networks in the mountains. They are both concerned about that the virus will be particularly damaging given the country's poor health service. Because the virus is only now moving into the southern hemisphere, some preliminary information can be found on Facebook postings. For example, one posting said that countries with the highest death toll are all said to be using 5G network. That's the 5th generation of wireless communication technologies supporting cellular data networks, and it's just called 5G. The coronavirus infection, the conspiracy theorists say, comes from 5G, which poisons cells in the body. And some people are said to use 5Gs to inject the coronavirus into people while giving vaccines. And so that's sort of 2 conspiracy theories tied together there. Arsonists in the United Kingdom and across Europe are destroying cell phone towers, and we might hear of this happening shortly in Papua New Guinea. Another Facebook posting said that Obama is asking Africans not to accept vaccines from America and Europe. And another, that Chinese foods are dangerous. Once posted, these theories circulate rapidly to the huge audience of cell phone users in Papua New Guinea. And one says drinking one's own urine is said to provide a cure. Religious and biblical themes are the most prominent, and talk of God's punishment at the end of the world. On balance, this small sample from Facebook suggests that they are providing that the government is providing good information. One post, skeptical of the religious messages, said, "We go with the science." The foreign response to the Kuru epidemic in the past suggests that social relationships may be radically altered. At the height of the Kuru epidemic, bride price payments were made for younger and younger girls. The donors said that the bride price now included a modest death payment, which would normally have come after the bride's death, and that the recipients shouldn't come crying for more when their wives died. It was assumed that the young girls would die young without giving birth to many children. You know, this is a horrific transformation of cultural ways that was very painful to watch. In the late 1950s, they stopped consuming the dead during mortuary rituals, which was a big thing. It was a key component of funerals. The spirit of the deceased person was said to remain in the woman's body until the many ceremonial events had taken place, which sometimes occurred weeks or months later, when the donors had assembled the costs required to host the event: pigs, money, pigs, chickens, and vegetables. With these ceremonies completed, the spirit of the dead person was released to join the ancestral spirits in the nearby forest. How to carry out funerals now may be a major problem. In recent years, funerals have become the largest ceremonial events among the Fore and elsewhere in Papua New Guinea, and perhaps elsewhere in the world. With warfare ended, visitors from more distant places now attend, bringing their wives, and politicians are also invited. The visitors are now housed in makeshift shelters, women separated from men, and the event requires close coordination in preparing and providing the food for this huge crowd. Social distancing will be impossible. In the coming days, many people from the coast will return to their home villages. There was a report today about 52 people from 3 villages along the border of Papua New Guinea with Indonesia, South Papua, who had sought refuge in more distant villages. A leader in one of the recipient communities said that their arrival had brought fear into the village because many people were dying in Indonesia. He called for the police to prevent such movements. We will know more in the coming days about how people respond to the pandemic, how they take care of the sick and bury the dead, and how the disease has been spreading. Anthropologists can provide important information about the response to the pandemic by people in faraway places, something historians call contemporary history, an important part of the record that otherwise will not be well documented. So that's my shout out for anthropologists.
Absolutely, thank you. And also Mir as well.
Yes, it's an example of a distant, faraway place, but I think that's what anthropologists would be doing now. I think much, contemporary history sounds a lot like an anthropological methodology we're familiar with.
Yeah. What I love so much about our discipline is that it's very experience near, and I feel that that's what we need right now.
Yes.
Is because that we need that connection, especially in a moment where we're forced not to connect.
Yes.
To focus on our humanity and our dignity and what is really important to us as a social species. I just want to say that this has been a real honor and pleasure to be able to facilitate this conversation with you. I'm sorry that Professor Singer couldn't be here at the end. It's been a real pleasure. We have, in some small way, tried to provide for our audience just some thoughts about the complexities in the social response to COVID-19, the many different layers in terms of political response, social response, the misinformation, the highlighting the deep inequalities and structural inequalities that have always been there, but that this pandemic just revealed how fragile our safety net and our ability to keep our heads above water. And finally, thinking about how our culture and community is being used all over the planet to be able to support communities at a distance, celebrate lives that we've lost, and so forth. We could talk more about incarcerated people, intimate partner violence, loneliness, social distancing, ageism, the interruption of treatment for people suffering from addiction. There's so much more that we could talk about, but I hope that our audience has been able to start this conversation and think about how important our role is as anthropologists moving forward. So thank you. It's been my pleasure. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you so much, Tanya, for this fantastic moderation. There were a lot of topics you had to kind of navigate us through. We also received many questions that those of us on the back end, we tried to kind of collate and present. We will continue to collect those questions. We will have a recording of this webinar on YouTube. It should be up within the next week. And perhaps what we can do is kind of list some of the questions so people can have conversations. We're going to try to figure out a different way to have a more interactive field. This webinar was quite large. We had almost 1,000 people who had registered. And so we really needed to kind of figure out how to make it interactive without actually making it interactive. It was just too many people for us to handle. But it was great and it was wonderful. And for that, I really thank all of the panelists for being here, for the work that you did, and for the really cogent, rigorous responses to the kinds of questions and thought-provoking sort of prompts that Tanya gave us. And thank you to all of you who have been watching and who have been streaming live when you watch this maybe later in a year, maybe in 10 years, who knows, with YouTube, it can be archived, right? So thank you for watching the webinar presentation by the Anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences. This is our last program for this academic year. Our programming will resume in the fall, during which the theme for programming throughout the year is reimagining resilience, engagement, estrangement, and the politics of choice. After this webinar, you will all receive an email providing an opportunity to sign up to our email list and a way for you to access the YouTube video. Right. Again, thank you to all the panelists and to all of you who have attended this from all over the globe.
Safe and healthy, please.
Safe and healthy. Be well and be safe. Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Professor Jones, Professor Lindenbaum, Professor Sangaramuthi, Dr. Bhootish.
Bhootish.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya.